Good day, everyone. We will begin our next session. My name is Stephen Joel Coons. I am the Executive Director of the Patient-Reported Outcome Consortium and Senior Vice President for the Clinical Outcome Assessment Program at Critical Path Institute. I want to add my welcome to the 12th Annual Patient-Reported Outcome Consortium Workshop. I joined Critical Path Institute in 2009 and have had the honor and privilege to lead the PRO Consortium since that time. As you heard in Sonia's presentation earlier today, one of the primary reasons the PRO Consortium exists is to facilitate the inclusion of more patient-focused information in medical product labeling, primarily through FDA qualification and public availability of PRO measures and other clinical outcome assessments. The focus of this session on successful inclusion of PRO-based labeling claims is near and dear to my heart, even though the PRO Consortium was not involved. So I have the pleasure of moderating this session, which is titled Migraine, A Tale of Two Paths to PRO-based Product Labeling. Housekeeping. Some of you may not have attended the earlier session, so I'll repeat this. So all attendee lines will be muted during the workshop. The workshop is being recorded and will be available on the PRO Consortium's website by the end of May. And then just note that the WebEx event Q&A function will not be used. And once we get to the Q&A portion, we'll open it up at the end of this session. If you'd like to ask a question, please open your participant panel, and you'll see down in the lower right-hand corner of that participant window a hand icon. And if you want to ask a question, and we certainly encourage questions during that question and answer period, please raise your hand and we'll make sure that we unmute your line when we get to you, and then we'll have you verbally ask your question. So the disclaimer, just to be sure you understand that the views and opinions expressed in the following slides are those of the individual presenters and should not be attributed to their respective organizations or companies, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or Critical Path Institute. So the session objectives are to discuss the critical role of patients in the evaluation of the clinical benefit of treatments for migraine, which is a common disabling neurological disease. Many of you know about the migraine and the important impact, significant impact that it does have. And through presentation of high-level timelines and interactions with FDA, we're going to describe and discuss two very different approaches that sponsors took in seeking similar novel PRO-based label claims within a new class of migraine drugs. And then we'll describe and discuss FDA's perspective and thinking regarding de novo measure development versus use or modification of an existing measure for the assessment of efficacy endpoints within clinical trials. And so to help me achieve these objectives, we are very fortunate to have a quite accomplished group of session participants. And if I could have the participants just start their video just during this introductory period, and then you can turn them off after the introductions are over. But we have provided you with the bio sketches for all the session participants, so please refer to that. I'm going to just give very brief introductions so that we don't waste precious time here. So along with me, we will have Dr. Billy Dunn providing opening remarks, and Billy is Director of the Office of Neuroscience within CDER at FDA. We have Dr. Pooja Desai, Director of U.S. Health Economics, Therapeutic Area Lead, Inflammation, Nephrology, and Bone at Amgen. We have Ms. Nicki Bush, Senior Advisor and Head, Patient-Focused Outcomes Center of Expertise at Eli Lilly and Company. And we have Dr. Eric Bastings, Acting Director, Division of Neurology 1, and Deputy Director of Office of Neuroscience within CDER at FDA. Dr. Nick Kozauer, Director, Division of Neurology 2, which is the division in which migraine drugs would be reviewed. And that's within the Office of Neuroscience in FDA CDER. And then many of you heard the prior session in which Dr. Electra Papadopoulos presented, and she's acting Deputy Director of the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment, Office of Drug Evaluation Sciences within the Office of New Drugs and CDER at the FDA. So very pleased to have these participants today. So thank you for putting your videos on, and you can turn those off now. Thanks. So I'll just give a few introductory remarks, and it's important just to set the stage, I think, in terms of this topic. So in this area of patient-focused drug development, there is an increasing emphasis on incorporating more patient-reported information in medical product labels. Not only label claims per se, but other information as well, patient experience information. And so I know many of you, if not all of you, you know that this is accelerating for a variety of reasons, and they're all positive. And although the PRO Consortium was not involved in the case studies presented in this session, we want to highlight and discuss two different PRO assessment strategies, or paths taken almost concurrently by Amgen and Lilly for products in a new class of migraine drugs for very similar concepts of interest. And the two paths taken during drug development by these firms were Amgen created a new measure, the Migraine Physical Function Impact Diary, and Lilly selected and then supported the use of an existing PRO measure, the Migraine Specific Quality of Life Questionnaire version 2.1. And the bottom line is that both paths led to novel PRO-based label claims, which we'll be hearing more about. Migraine, in terms of this disease state, migraine is a common disabling primary headache disorder that affects roughly 12% of the U.S. population. It's quite prevalent. It is considered the third most prevalent illness and the sixth most disabling illness globally. There are several different types of migraine, but a major distinction is between episodic and chronic, simplistically described as the following. And I put simplistically there because it is nuanced, and there are some subtleties in the way that these definitions are applied. But just very simplistically, episodic migraine are headaches on fewer than 15 days per month, and chronic migraine are headaches on 15 or more days per month. And it should be noted, and this is important, that in treatment trials for migraine, whether they be acute or preventive therapies, patients have routinely been the source of clinical benefit data. The symptoms and sensations associated with migraine can only be reported by people experiencing them. So it's important to know, have that understanding that there are no biomarkers within migraine at this point in time. And so we do rely on and have relied on information directly from patients for approvals of these products. And for migraine preventive therapies, the primary efficacy endpoints are customarily based on patient-reported headache or migraine headache frequency data. However, the patient-reported consequences or proximal impacts of migraine on daily activities had not been routinely addressed in migraine product labeling claims. So the two PRO measurement strategies we're discussing in this session successfully address that void. So that's a brief introduction, and now I'm pleased to be able to turn it over to Dr. Billy Dunn to just provide some opening remarks. Billy?
Thanks, Stephen. You want to give me a little thumbs up that you can hear me all right? All right. Well, Stephen put himself on mute to tell me that he can hear me, so I'll accept that. That's good. There's just quiet laughter. Hey, how are y'all doing? Obviously, I'm Billy Dunn. As you heard, I'm the director of the Office of Neuroscience. Been attending this meeting for quite some time. Really pleased to be here today. Since we had a cancellation last year due to COVID, I thought it might be good just to mention there's some regulars and there's also new people who attend every year. And the Office of Neuroscience is a really nice opportunity at the agency. I don't remember exactly whether we already discussed this with this consortium in my last talk, but there was a reorganization in the Office of New Drugs over the last few years, and most of you all know me for the long term as the former director of the Division of Neurology Products. And I now lead the Office of Neuroscience, which includes neurology split into two divisions, Neurology 1 and Neurology 2, along with psychiatry, anesthesiology, addiction medicine, pain medicine, sleep products, non-clinical neuroscience are all in the Office of Neuroscience now. So just by way of orientation, I thought I'd mention that, and very happy to be here. I don't want to steal too many minutes from what are going to be some really superb talks, and I know a very robust panel discussion, but I'm really glad Stephen was able to coordinate this for this meeting. This was supposed to be presented at last year's meeting, which was canceled, obviously because of COVID. And perhaps first and most importantly, I hope everyone that is attending the meeting has done well with the pandemic. And for anybody who has faced personal challenges therein, my thoughts are with you for that. It's been a difficult time for a lot of people, but I'm hopeful that we see the light now at the end of the tunnel, and I hope we're all gonna come out of this strong. But with that said, I'm really glad that this session persisted and that we're able to get it on the agenda for this meeting, because this is a really neat story. So a few comments I'll offer might be a little redundant with what Stephen just presented, but I still think they're useful. This is a very neat story, and more importantly, it's a really neat opportunity to hear the story from people who I hope are eager to tell it. I know they are. I've seen the slides, but also have a tremendous knowledge base in that space. So, it was Lilly and Amgen, the two companies who you're going to hear from today, that really thought up this session as they were going through their first approvals of a new class of migraine products, the CGRP antagonists. A really revolutionary time for the treatment of migraine. You heard about its impact on public health. This is a tremendously important arena. And Amgen, who sponsored a drug called Erenumab, and Lilly, who sponsored a drug called galcanezumab. Amgen's product was approved first in May of 2018, and Lilly's followed shortly thereafter in September of 2018. They basically, as they were considering each other's products, as companies are wont to do when they're competing, they were looking at each other's labels, saw what they were doing, maybe heard a little bit about it during the development phase, and they said, hey, look, Lilly noticed that Amgen had developed a novel instrument that hadn't been described before in migraine labeling. So Lilly kind of said, oh, that's neat. And Amgen noticed that Lilly leveraged an existing instrument in this space, and Amgen kind of thought, oh, that's interesting. And so, kind of like bashfully, batting eyes across the dance floor, I guess they decided, let's have a talk about this. And I think that's a really good idea, because not only do we have a new area of information that we're presenting in migraine labeling, there's two different approaches. You heard Stephen mention that. And particularly interesting is that one approach really did develop a new instrument over a very long period of time, the proverbial soup to nuts kind of development. And then the other sponsor decided to use existing knowledge, an existing instrument, and work with us to get it fit for description and labeling. Another important aspect of what both these companies were trying to do is that they were trying to evaluate functional information that's relevant to patients. So a really important thing is that these instruments really align with our desire to directly reflect the patient voice in the impact of our drugs and our therapies on the patient's experience. And so this is a real great opportunity to have done that. The information these sponsors provided after extensive discussion with us, ultimately ended up in section 14 of the prescribing information, the clinical study section, where the studies supporting approval and the meaningful effects that we find associated with those drugs are described to inform the prescriber about how these drugs may best be used in managing patients with the condition for which the drugs are prescribed. You know, and this is really appropriate for this group, because I think every year folks in the PRO Consortium, based on the type of things they work on, like to get together and discuss. You kind of hear it in the hallway, and I kind of miss that in-person presence. But you know, how did you get that in labeling? You know, where did that come from? What was the discussion with the FDA like? You know, this is a really exciting opportunity to do just that, and you're going to hear it, you know, kind of from firsthand from the source. And it's important to note that we're always open to discussion about how best to incorporate, well, any outcome really. We're open to discussion, but especially wanted to note today, open to discussions of how best to incorporate the patient voice into development. Migraine impact can only be observed by an external observer to a limited degree. Certainly you can see somebody in pain, you can quantify things like missed days of work. There is to a degree an observational component to it. But the experience of migraine is personal, and the patient report of that experience is critical to capture, including not only the patient's experience of their primary migraine manifestations, but also the daily impact of having a migraine, the consequences of having a migraine, the things that happen in a person's life that are associated with having a migraine, negative things, challenging things. And I think that's really what these efforts from these sponsors were kind of after capturing. You know, we consistently capture how bad does it hurt? Are you nauseated? Do you have light sensitivity or sound sensitivity? These are the hallmarks of migraine, and we're familiar with those. But here we have an opportunity to translate those symptoms into the reasons why Stephen presented that the migraine advocacy groups tell us, you know, about the massive global impact of disability that migraine conveys to patients with the condition. And so we have a real good chance to gain insight into that and to pass that insight on to our prescribers and our patients. So I think that's wonderful. And another aspect of this that I really want to note is I love when we actually get our industry colleagues to come tell a story. Generally, this is a good consortium. It's not as bad as some in this, but my industry colleagues are so often just absolutely brilliant in their field. There's tremendous talent there, tremendous knowledge. But for a variety of reasons, just like we at the FDA often can't talk about things because they're confidential, you know, my industry colleagues often are very good at attending meetings, but often take a lot more notes than they do speak up, and there's lots of reasons for that. But when you have a chance to hear from a developer about how they went about something, it's a tremendously valuable opportunity. So we're going to have some great presentations today, followed by a panel discussion. As you heard, we're going to hear Dr. Desai from Amgen tell the story about erenumab. And then we're going to hear Ms. Bush from Lilly talk about galcanezumab. And again, I've seen the slides in advance, and very, very compelling stories. So pay good attention to that. And then on the panel, I'll be around. But more importantly, you have Dr. Bastings, who is really, his knowledge base is unbelievable. He's really the godfather, I think, of migraine drug development over the years. He's done so much to transform and advance drug development for migraine. He's really been a very powerful force there. So a tremendous opportunity to have him on the panel. And Dr. Kozauer, of course, who leads the Division of Neurology 2 in my office, and a longstanding colleague who I have the greatest esteem for, and is really, really thoughtful about the approaches that we are bringing to these new and exciting migraine therapies coming along. So really happy that he's here. And of course, I think this organization's favorite panelist in many ways, Dr. Papadopoulos, been working with her for a very long time, and thrilled that she's going to be here to help provide the insight from her position. And you heard a little bit about that the last session. So I hope those comments were helpful. I'm excited about this session. I'm going to go off video, but I'll pop back up for the panel and listen to my co-panelists and the presenters. So welcome. I'm glad you're here. We're very glad to be here. And I wish you all very well.
Thank you, Billy. And I really appreciate, we all really appreciate your insight as well as your enthusiasm for this topic. And we're so glad you're a part of this panel. So I will turn it over to Pooja.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pooja Desai, and I am going to be talking about the development of a novel patient-reported outcomes tool called the Migraine Physical Function Impact Diary, or the MPFID as we call it lovingly, which was developed to assess the impact of migraine on everyday activities and physical impairment. I'll start by providing a brief overview of the iranimab development program and the development of the MPFID. And then I'll talk a little bit about the timelines of our interactions with the FDA. And as Dr. Dunn mentioned, what our story was, while we developed the MPFID. So the iranimab development program consisted of 2 episodic migraine trials and 1 chronic migraine trial. The primary endpoint in all these pivotal trials was a reduction from baseline in the number of mean monthly migraine days. The clinical and the commercial teams at Amgen were always committed to including the patient voice in the clinical development program, and this is what led to the development of the MPFID and influenced our whole development program. Our early qualitative work identified certain holistic concepts that were identified as being important by the patients. A specific area that we focused on was physical functioning, and this was based on what we heard from patients as well as our interactions with the FDA, because physical functioning is considered to be more proximal to migraine, and this is what led to the final development of the MPFID. We heard from patients that social and emotional impacts are important as well, but they are more distal to migraine, and hence they did not form a focus of the MPFID. The MPFID was developed in accordance with the FDA PRO guidance, and patient input was key. We started with the qualitative work consisting of concept elicitation interviews with around 30 chronic and episodic migraine patients. Saturation was achieved as a part of this process, and then we moved on to cognitive interviews to ensure that patients had a clear understanding of the concept that we were trying to measure. We also conducted usability testing to ensure equivalence between the electronic and paper and pen version of the MPFID. This was followed by a quantitative phase to establish reliability and validity and to conduct item reduction. All this information is available in the public domain. This was important to us because it was important for our interactions with the agency, and also because we always wanted to make this tool available to the general public, along with all the supporting qualitative and quantitative work, and hence all this information has been published. The MPFID, as it stands now, has 13 items across 2 domains. The 2 domains are impact on everyday activities and physical impairment. Both these domains were included as key secondary endpoints in the episodic migraine trials. They also both made it to the label. They're included in section 14 of the label. In addition, we had 1 global item on the overall impact on everyday activities. This was an exploratory endpoint and hence is not a part of the label. The MPFID has a recall period for 24 hours. As we all know, migraine is a disease that waxes and wanes, and therefore we went with a 24-hour recall period to be able to capture the variability in the disease symptoms. This was something that we heard from patients as well during our interviews. And this was especially important because most of the legacy instruments have a longer recall period, and hence they may not be as sensitive to this variability. From the beginning, it has always been Amgen's commitment to make the MPFID available in the public domain. We have now contracted with Evidera for the distribution of the MPFID. We also work very closely with Evidera throughout the development process. Academic institutes and non-pharma research groups can get this tool for free, And for pharma, there's a small user fee that Evidera charges. The MPFID was developed in close collaboration with the FDA, and it was very important for us as Amgen to align with the FDA through our development process. So we consulted with the FDA and worked with them very closely throughout the development and implementation process of the Aimovig PRO strategy. I'll now briefly go over some of the timelines associated with the development and the interactions that we had with the FDA. Amgen's commitment to include patient voice in the clinical development program led to the development of the MPFID. And this process started before the initiation of the phase 2 study, when we were asked by our clinical development team to come up with a PRO strategy prior to engaging with the FDA. The Erenumab program at that time was a very rapidly moving program, and this timing wasn't ideal, but we still prepared for an interaction with the FDA, and we are glad we did. Our first interaction occurred in 2013, and the agency indicated that a measure assessing a patient's physical functioning may be best suited to adequately capture the impact of a new therapy on patients incrementally over a reduction in mean monthly migraine days, which forms the primary endpoint of almost all migraine clinical trials. As the disease is very variable, the agency also recommended that we use a daily diary to capture the severity of the core migraine disease symptoms. This is what we heard from patients as well during our interviews, that they thought it was very important to be able to capture the variability in the disease symptoms. At the time we spoke with the FDA, they told us that none of the existing instruments in the migraine space were fit for purpose and reliable and valid to adequately capture the patient's perspective on the impact of migraine on physical functioning. And this is what led us down the path to build a de novo instrument rather than trying to retrofit an existing tool. This is what started the process of the development of the MPFID. Over the next few years, we worked closely with the FDA and followed the FDA PRO guidance in developing the de novo tool. We aligned with the FDA on the need for a single instrument across episodic and chronic migraine patients because both these groups of patients reported similar concepts and similar symptoms and impacts during patient interviews. We also aligned on having two domains for the MPFID, impact on everyday activities and physical impairment, as well as the cross-sectional psychometric properties. Another area of alignment was to define a clinically meaningful response on the MPFID. Throughout this development process, we worked closely with the FDA, and we also shared data with them every step of the way. For example, key deliverables such as saturation matrices from our qualitative work and details around item reduction, the psychometric properties and such were shared with the FDA during the interaction. I'll quickly move on to the next slide to give a brief overview of what the tool actually looks like. So as I said, the version that was used in the phase 3 studies has 13 items across 2 domains, and there is a single global item on the overall impact on everyday activities. The difficulty questions have a 5-point response option ranging from without any difficulty to unable to do, and the frequency items have a 5-point response option ranging from none of the time to all of the time. In 2017, we submitted a PRO dossier in support of the MPFID along with the Aimovig BLA. In 2018, Aimovig was approved, and during label negotiation, the FDA agreed to add data and language associated with the MPFID to Section 14 of the USPI. Over the years, there has been an evolution in how the FDA evaluates legacy instruments. but given our early interaction and the feedback that we received, we thought that going down the path of developing a de novo tool was the best option. We engaged with the FDA to ensure that concepts that were most valuable to patients were appropriately captured and represented. Based on the input that we received, our interpretation was that the risk was too high to try and retrofit an existing instrument, since we were told that none of the existing tools were fit for purpose to assess physical functioning. Given where we were in our development process, we thought that it was best for us to develop a de novo tool to accurately capture the patient experience. We as Amgen had several key learnings from this process. I think the most important learning for us was to start early and have frequent interactions with the FDA. Kudos to the agency for being so open, so responsive, and so engaged and interactive throughout the development process of the MP-FIT. We truly believe that this was a key element for success. The scientific field around COAs is evolving quite rapidly, and so frequent interactions with the agency to ensure alignment with the PRO strategy is also very important. At Amgen, as a result of this entire development process, there has been a new development in terms of introduction of the patient-centered outcomes research team. This consists of a dedicated group of individuals focused on COAs, which will enable us to engage with our cross-functional teams early on and determine a PRO strategy very early during the development process, which will then in turn facilitate early interactions with the FDA, which we believed were critical to success. Our commitment at Amgen is to ensure that the label accurately reflects the patient's experience, and we believe that the MP-FIT does just that. In order to ensure that the patient perspective can be accurately captured in clinical trials, this tool has been made available in the public domain along with all the supporting qualitative and quantitative work should anyone want to use it in migraine clinical trials. I think that is all that I had. Thank you very much for your time, and I will now transfer it over to Ms. Bush to talk about the Lilly experience.
Thanks very much, Pooja. So I'll talk a little bit about our journey at Lilly, and it's very similar in steps taken. We just made a few different decisions along the way, and I hope this sets up for a really good discussion, a really robust discussion. So a little bit of background: galcanezumab is indicated for the preventive treatment of migraines. We had 3 pivotal studies, 2 in episodic and 1 in chronic migraine. An impact of migraine on daily activities, which I've italicized here, is the language that's used in our label. It was assessed using the MSQ version 2.1, a specific domain called the Role Function Restrictive, or the RFR domain score. And the endpoint was mean change from baseline in average score. It was the key secondary and gated in all 3 studies. The primary was a mean change from baseline of monthly migraine headache days in each study, and all of this information is available in publications. And it was the typical primary endpoint that we use in migraine prevention. So a little bit about the MSQ version 2.1, and we did use an ePRO version. It is migraine specific, and the original developers described it as a quality of life and functioning instrument. It has a 4-week recall period, and there are 3 domains in total. So the RFR, role function preventive, and then emotional function. We did look at each of these. We administered the entire instrument, and we did, though, only gate the 1 domain. Originally, this was developed in 1992. It was modified in 1998, and then Lilly sponsored the migration to electronic administration for the current development program. So in deciding whether to use an existing instrument or develop a new instrument or modify an instrument, obviously, not all instruments are created equally, which is why we have a PRO guidance, which is why we have a PSDD guidance, a series of guidance documents. And so we did look at the original development, and it includes a lot of patient interviews, clinician interviews, both from concept elicitation and then going back to patients to do cognitive interviewing. There were quite a bit of assessment of other measurement properties, and it was also widely used and interpretable for that reason, and among others. And what Lilly decided to do was additional concept elicitation, cognitive interviews, and then usability for the device it was on, and then assessment of other measurement properties. And so a little bit about our timeline. We submitted our original IND in 2011. And because of how drug development works, it kind of went out of house, came back to Lilly, sponsorship in December of 2013. In April of the next year, we had a Type C interaction, and that's really when we started talking about what this assessment of function could look like. In September of 2015, at the end of phase 2, is when we started to get a good signal that pulling out this domain and including it might be possible. These aren't all the interactions that we had, it's just a select few. We did have a lot of discussion with the agency throughout, and I will say this was not a risk-free decision to make. So we went at risk the entire time. It was clear that it would be a review issue. We worked with the agency to discuss the importance of the concept, which we obviously agreed on. And when putting together our evidence package, we knew that it wasn't going to look like a quote unquote typical PRO dossier. We didn't have every single element. So for instance, we don't have an item tracking matrix because we have access to the published work, but not the original research done for the instrument. So we instead have a table of item relevance, looking at the comprehensiveness of the instrument using our own concept elicitation work and existing literature. So sort of a hybrid approach. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I'd be remiss not to mention the MACOAs that I know Robin and Michelle and RJ talked about earlier. That we have these labels, and I know we have these different instruments assessing function or impact on daily activities, but there is an ongoing initiative to look at clinical outcome assessments and develop or identify a core set to be used in clinical trials with the same population. And at that point, I will turn it over to anyone from FDA who would like to share any comments.
Yes, thank you, Nicki. And so for this panel discussion, and we're not moving into the Q&A session yet, but if all the panelists could put their video back on, and then we will open it up for replies or responses to what was just discussed by Pooja and Nicki. So we can start the way it's listed. Eric, do you have any specific comments related to what you just heard or what you experienced when this whole process was going on?
Yeah, just a few comments. I think the key aspect is that, as you heard from both sponsors, there was an extensive interaction with both of them as they progressed in the creation of their scale or in the adaptation of the existing scale and in the validation work. So that's an interaction that spanned over a number of years and eventually led to the inclusion of both of these endpoints in labeling. And it's something that we do a lot in the divisions in the office. A lot of the conditions for which we have development program do not yet have validated endpoints, and sometimes they are existing scales that have been developed for other reasons than to support drug development. For example, they've been developed for use in the clinic, and then they may be the only scale existing. There may be a rare condition where that's the only scale around, and so sponsors come and propose using it. And there is a lot of work that starts, but typically involve our COA colleagues, where we look at the existing instrument and figure out item by item and element by element what provides clinically meaningful information about the drug effect and what doesn't. And so there is a work that can be done to improve the existing outcome and try to make it fit for purpose for use in a clinical study to show a drug effect. Another approach is to design the instrument from the ground up, right? So you do all of the work that has been done, like in the Amgen example, where you start with patients and you elicit the concepts and so on, and you do the process that has been described. And that too needs a lot of interaction with the agency. It takes an early discussion on how to do this, what to go after, and as you progress, there are face-to-face meetings that will take place. That could be during a structured meeting, like an end of phase 2 meeting, but we also have a lot of ad hoc meetings that can be face-to-face or that can be WRO, where feedback is provided. So we really work together to come up with an endpoint that is fit for purpose. In the cases here, the entire work may not even be finished or fully reviewed by the time the NDA is submitted, because ideally you do all of that work before you do your pivotal studies, and then you use the endpoint that has been validated. But in the case here, some of the validation was still taking place as the phase 3 studies were ongoing. So the work really gets finished when the application is reviewed. So I know that's probably a bit stressful for sponsors, because I'm sure they would much prefer having that work done earlier, but we try to be efficient. And I think an expression that was used is that we were flying the plane as we were building it, because some of the work was still taking place during the review. But at the end of the day, both sponsors had the endpoint described in the label.
Thank you, Eric. Nick, any comments?
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to mostly defer to Dr. Bastings and Dr. Papadopoulos to comment on these presentations, primarily because these applications were in-house before the reorganization, and so I wasn't involved in Migraine at that time. But as a general statement, I completely agree with everything that Dr. Bastings said. There are often different ways to get to the end goal, and we're very eager to work with sponsors and seeking to develop patient-reported endpoints, and it's very important to us and continues to be. And again, there are different ways to get there, and we're certainly happy to engage in discussions about how to proceed along either path. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Electra, any comments?
Yes, I would like to just echo what the others have said about the importance of seeking FDA input early when you're thinking about going into an area that, for which there hasn't been precedent. And, congratulations to both of these sponsors. I think, you have really paved the way not only for migraine, but by providing these examples, you've paved the way also for other disease areas where people may be interested in evaluating the impacts of disease in addition to sort of the primary hallmark symptoms. This really kind of harkens back to the meeting we had in 2018, which is the 9th annual workshop of the PRO Consortium. And we had a session called Why Reinvent the Wheel? And we were talking about this very topic. And, you know, I think we kind of, that started a really good discussion, and ultimately we published a paper with the authors, two of which are here, maybe actually everyone's here. And it basically, you know, it's really a misconception that, you know, FDA requires every single box of the PRO 2009 guidance to be checked, you know, to fulfill the need for fit-for-purpose instrumentation. And, you know, there are many ways to get there. And at the end of the day, we just really want a carefully thought through approach. There could be existing instrumentation. We could have information from, say, literature, perhaps supplemented, where there might be some gaps to fill. So I think this is you know, having these examples, I think, will really go a long way to helping, like I said, not only people looking to develop drugs in migraine, but also in other therapeutic areas.
Thank you, Electra. And I think that point you just made is an important one. And I believe, and certainly within the context of the PRO consortium, early on, we really did believe, based on what we interpreted as the evidentiary expectations laid out in the draft guidance in 2006 and then the final PRO guidance, we really did feel that we needed these elements that you alluded to, Nicki alluded to them earlier, essentially concept elicitation interview reports, or possibly transcripts, item or saturation grids, item tracking matrices. And so we, within the PRO consortium, we did undertake the development of new measures. And now in retrospect, we realize that we didn't need to do that or shouldn't have done that necessarily. But it is good to have a better understanding now that there is a way, and Nicki provided a good example of how that was achieved, how ultimately using the measure in the label claim was achieved by providing sufficient evidence. And I guess, Nicki, I'll just go back to you on this, because you mentioned that you were doing this at risk. And I do think that it did take courage to do what you did, and knowing, because you were a part of the efforts within the PRO consortium and some of those decisions that were made regarding de novo instrument development as opposed to the use or modification of existing measures. So I guess, is there anything more you can say, Nicki, about the evidence, you know, because I talked about you selected and then supported, and so obviously you needed to support and meet the evidentiary expectations of FDA, but you were able to assemble the information you need that sufficiently justified why you wanted to use that measure. Any more insight into that? I mean, I'm assuming you'd do the same thing all over again because it ended up working out well.
Yeah, well, it did end up working out well. You know, and I just want to comment, you know, when Pooja mentioned having a 24-hour recall period, you know, I literally lost sleep at night. There were times when I'm like, I don't know how our data are going to separate enough, right? Like, is it going to be sensitive enough to really pick up on it? It was a decision we made not to change or not to try to change the recall period because of where we were in our drug development program. So all of these decisions get made, and I don't know if it's courage or you make the best decision you can in the moment when you have to make a decision, and that at the time, given where we were, was the best decision to make with all of the elements that go into doing that. But as far as putting the evidence package together, I think it really was, and I have to, there were a large team at Lilly, a large team with our research partners who helped pull all of this together. And it was approaching the evidence package to look for evidence of fit for purpose. So not anything perfect, not anything overly precise. The instrument assessed what it needed to assess in the way it needed to assess it. And so I always think of the evidence as three sort of pillars of, are you measuring the right thing? Are you measuring it well? And are the data meaningful and interpretable? And so and then it's a matter of building evidence under each one. The concept was clearly important. We had a lot of information from literature and some of our own original research to show that the concept really mattered. And then it was a matter of looking at the instrument and saying, was it fit enough to measure this concept well enough? And we didn't have how we would typically go back to the qualitative work, look at every word, adjust each item, and have those tracking matrices through rounds and rounds of cognitive interviewing. But we could look at the literature. We went to patients, and we wanted to make sure that it was understandable and that it was comprehensive, so that there aren't any elements of this role function restrictive domain, of this impact on daily activities, that we were missing. Did we need to add another item or another concept to fill out that concept? And then making sure the data are meaningful and interpretable. We did a lot of work around looking at meaningful within patient change, and confirming that and triangulating a lot of different methods to do so. And so we included a lot of the elements of a typical dossier, but we tried to just be really foundational about what does it mean to be fit for purpose and what is our best, hobbling together everything, the best case for it, because we knew it was important.
No, thank you. Thank you for that further detail. Pooja, I just wanted to ask you a question in terms of, you said that Evidera, and that's what an important element of this is, that both of these measures are publicly available. And you're saying even the new measure, the MP-FID, is available through Evidera. And so if someone wanted to use that, do they just go to the Evidera website and they would be able to get to the licensing page for this measure? Or how would they go through that licensing process with Evidera?
That's correct. The information is available on the Evidera website to get to the appropriate person. But if anyone has any questions, they can feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to connect them to folks at Evidera as well, which will enable them to get the instrument.
Okay, thank you. And then one other question about your development work for the MP-FID. And this may have been clear in your timeline, and I missed it. How far in advance of your phase 3 program did you actually start the development of the MP-FID?
This is a great question. Our phase 3 started somewhere around the 2015 timeframe, and our first interaction with the FDA around the PRO strategy was in 2013, and we had already done some work prior to that with regards to early cognitive interviews and some literature reviews and such. So I would say about 2.5 years before start of phase 3 to get through all the qualitative work and the quantitative work to have the tools ready for incorporation into phase 3.
Okay, thank you. And then I wanted to get back to Nick. I know you're involved in the MACOA's project that was mentioned earlier in the earlier session, as well as Nicki's last slide. And I guess I just want to get a sense, we have examples here of a couple of measures that were successfully used to support a labeling claim around generally everyday activities. And do you see, I guess there are obviously the MACOA's project is important, and it was funded because there's still the perception that there is a gap in the measurement of the impact of migraine on people's lives, but I just want to get any insight you might have in terms of what your hopes are for the MCOA's project.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That's a great question. I can just make maybe a general comment to start, is that whenever you have an endpoint or endpoints, and this is not necessarily even specific to this to these endpoints described in labeling, there's always a risk that those endpoints are viewed as a gold standard, because just by virtue of the fact that they're in labeling, right? And so the unintended consequence of that sometimes can be the limitation of further work in an area. And so here, as we've been hearing, you have two endpoints that are described in labeling that were the product of a tremendous amount of work on behalf of the sponsors and collaboration with the agency, and they're in the label. But this is a really important area. This is an area of a lot of interest, and it's something that we still want to continue to stimulate work in, and the MCOA's grant is certainly one mechanism to help do that. And I guess just one example is that from the early qualitative work in the MCOA's program, one of the things that has come out, and it's something that we've thought about as well here, is that cognition is really important to patients with migraine. Days they have attacks, but also in between attacks, and that's something that perhaps these scales don't address as directly as maybe might be needed. So that's just one example, but it is not a commentary really on these scales. It's just that this is a really important space, and we want to continue to stimulate interest in it.
Thank you for that, Nick. That's important additional insight. So I guess I'd like to open up to any of the panelists to ask any questions of any of the other panelists.
I might make a comment and then ask my industry colleagues to then comment a little further.
Sure.
I kind of wanted to acknowledge the timelines involved and put a little context around that. So it's important to recognize that outcome measure discussions can have varying levels of complexity. We had here an attempt to use an existing measure, but bring a lot of thoughtfulness to it. And existing measures can often, I think existing measures can sometimes be a less efficient way to go than developing a new one, depending on the state of the initial measure. It just kind of really depends greatly on what you're starting with. If you're starting with again, kind of a scale established in academia somewhere that's just kind of become, widely known, and maybe it was just kind of invented to help a doc follow his or her patients in clinic. We have a whole spectrum of these things. That can be a tough place to start, and sometimes it's hard to divorce people from the notion that it might not even be a good thing to start with because it's widely entrenched in a given space. So there's a real variety of needs there, and I think on those timelines were so valuable because we always say, come talk to us early. And this is a situation where in a very established environment, migraine development, that was really having a bit of a renaissance, if you will, in terms of how we're thinking about things and how we're fitting it into patient voice issues. We had an opportunity to consider perhaps a more complicated approach to this than, say, maybe think of a measure of walking, that's intended to be used as a primary outcome. We do that every day with sponsors, and although it would probably be a little disingenuous to say that we can reach agreement on that in a day, I don't want people to think that these two cases mean that every time you want to talk about a measure, you got to come talk to us for 5 years or more. I mean, that's, people are always frustrated about, there's a perception that qualification is lengthy and painful, and I certainly understand that, but there's a breadth to qualification that requires a rigor. But we often also say, in contradistinction to that a sponsor coming to us that wants to work on an outcome, we do this every day. Dr. Bastings alluded to this. We can reach agreement on outcomes really easily if the substrate is there to do so. It's not just kind of strung along. But this is a situation where you're entering a novel environment in migraine, a potentially very important environment, and not being described in labeling previously. It's important for us to not only get it right, but to make sure that the way we're going to describe it doesn't convey inappropriate information about the new agents and doesn't convey an inappropriate perception of lack of information or failure in previous agents. These are very important things to think about in terms of what domains, what approaches, what measurements, what interpretations go along with a new approach. In addition, these companies, these are big, sophisticated, knowledgeable companies, but they came to us early. You heard the comment about 2013 versus phase 3 initiation in 15. So on the one hand, we can be very agile. There's no question about it when we need to be. We're not going to sit and kind of just be, stony old FDA. We have a very needy disease. Maybe it's a rare disease, doesn't have a good scale, and they're ready to do a study. We're not going to say, well, we can do that in 5 years because we're going to work on all the we got to go help those patients. We need to get things into the clinical study environment. But by the same token, by coming to us early, you allow for a linear and thoughtful approach to building up an outcome like this. So without the pressures of a short time scale, then you have the opportunity for these linear conversations to build upon each other, and there's an enjoyable aspect to that and a rewarding aspect to that as well. So this is both a very good story and a good model, but it's very easy to think that each little point of the story is necessary or applicable to any future endeavor, and that's not necessarily true. It really depends an awful lot on the substrate and the surrounding factors. So I kind of wanted to point that out. Now, none of that is to say that we didn't move quickly through this. There was a lot of back and forth with both of these sponsors about the aspects of what they were developing, and again, there were some novelties to that development that did require a lot of thoughtful consideration. But they did the right thing in coming to us so that discussion could occur in parallel with development, but not interfere with development and allow it to be as thoughtful as possible on both sides. So I wanted to provide that kind of context and ask either of my industry colleagues if they wanted to build on that or tell me I'm wrong. Anything you'd like to say about that. But that's my perception of what we did with you. I have to call on people first. How about Nicki? How about you go first?
Sure. Do I get to tell you you're wrong? I don't think that you are, but it just seems like a great opportunity. I think it's important that we went early. I think the thoughtful asking of questions is, so, a lot has happened, and I don't know if it's across all industry. I've seen it within Lilly. The walking into a meeting with the agency and being comfortable enough to ask a real question. I feel like we used to craft these questions where I was like, I wouldn't even know how to answer that. It was just trying to find something out, and then we would read the tea leaves, and it was basically like modern poetry when you were going through like FDA feedback and trying to understand, all the meaning and the nuance. And what I really appreciated about this process is it was, for the most part, very straightforward. We had a question, we went with a question, and we got the best thinking in the moment and a clear response each time. And that set a really good model for interaction. I will say internally, from an industry perspective, as time went on, managing the expectations of my internal team about the risk got more and more difficult because there was this, well, if the FDA still seems on board, then this sort of assumption of, well, if it goes in a label, and then, all of these other activities take place of how do you develop a commercial program and how do you, getting ready for launch. And so trying to pull back and say, just because we have an agreement that the concept matters and just because they know we're using this and that we're going down this road, there was never a guarantee. And internally, that keeping everybody, because we didn't know until the last minute and whether we would be able to get it into label or not. And so it was definitely a risk.
Thanks. Pooja, I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of that also.
I would completely agree with what you said. For an Amgen perspective, it was a very collaborative and an insightful exchange with the FDA. And I think it was, I completely agree with what Billy just mentioned, that it was very timely. Some of the responses that we got were very, very timely because it was a rapidly moving clinical development program, and we were able to get that feedback to be able to incorporate it into our clinical trials so as to not impact the clinical development program in any way. So I completely agree with what Biddy said, and I also completely agree with what Nicki said. We had a hard time managing expectations within Amgen as well, especially after there was information out there that there's another sponsor using an existing tool. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of questions raised. Why did we choose to go this way? And why didn't we use an existing tool? So there was, and we didn't know till the very last minute whether we are going to make it to label or not as well. So managing expectations was difficult, but I will totally agree that the FDA has been phenomenal in the way they supported us through the development process.
And Stephen, I would just say too, we talk a lot about the time it takes to develop an instrument and how in the PRO consortium, it's great to work in a pre-competitive environment so that we can put all of our heads together, have an instrument and agree on it, and the development works really well. But even if instrument development or putting together an evidence package, even if it's fast, the contemporaneousness of drug development, because we tend to work in that same class at the same time, and you saw that we were at points, 4 months, 6 months from each other. There was just no way, even though I think we both wanted to, there was no way for us to have that collaboration in the moment. And we just hadn't had it years before. So that becomes an issue. I think, it would have been ideal if we could have paused both programs, had a discussion and agreed on what the best measure was and all moved forward and all have the same evidence and understanding, but that doesn't fit in the drug development model, unfortunately.
Just a comment, Stephen.
Yeah.
Just
go ahead, Eric.
Stephen. This is Eric. So in this situation, the endpoint was not a primary endpoint, right? It was a secondary endpoint. And I think it gave a bit more comfort in letting some of that work go pretty late in phase 3, and even during the NDA review, there was a lot of back and forth. It's not that we knew the answer, and we did not communicate it to the sponsor. I think there was a lot of back and forth throughout the application review, and the decision was made, quite frankly, pretty late in the review, whether to describe it or not. If you have a situation where this is the primary endpoint, I think it's really advisable try to do more of the work early on, and doing that work, late in the process like we did here, may be more risky, even riskier than in this case. Because in this case, if the endpoint at the end of the day did not make it to the label, it will not affect the approvability of the product, right? If we're talking about the primary endpoint, then the risk is considerably greater. So in that situation, we probably want to do more of it, earlier in the process.
Yeah, that's a really good point from Dr. Bastings. If we had a sponsor coming to us with something that's novel or in a dimension that's outside what's typical, and we understand that they're seeking to use it as a primary endpoint, the tone and approach to the advice, will reflect that, right? So it's, we would endeavor not to have a sponsor, be in a situation where they're kind of getting to end game. If we knew that they were going to use something as a primary, we're going to have some really kind of fundamental talks, kind of sit down and let's talk, right? So that's a very different situation, and I concur strongly with what Dr. Bastings was saying.
Thank you for that. And I believe we should probably move into opening it up to the general audience for Q&A. I want to say one thing in terms of, we talked about the availability of the MP-FID through Evidera, and also the MSQ version 2.1 is available through eProvide, I guess. Nicki, that is the case. Mappy Research Trust is the distributor of that.
Yeah. As far as I know, yes.
Okay, good. Then let's open it up for Q&A. And so just to remind everybody, if you'd like to ask a question, open your participant panel, then click the hand icon in the lower right-hand corner to raise your hand. And so please do that. I know we do have some questions. Adam Butler, I believe you had a question.
Two are the two to start with, right? I mean, those are. Does the 5 UTT, would that require anything different, Arvin, or could we use that one as well?
Adam?
You just walk and turn, right? You do the U-turns.
Yeah, just making 5 U-turns.
Okay.
We might have somebody. Yeah. Somebody that might not be.
Right. While we have people, I hope people will raise their hands, because I know there are questions out there. And maybe this is question for you, Eric. Just to describe briefly, this was a BLA as opposed to an NDA. It was reviewed by essentially the Division of Neurology Products at that point in time in CDER. Just explain to us why that is the case, that a biologic would go through CDER in this case.
Right. Around 2005, a number of products that were previously reviewed by CBER got transferred to CDER, and these were the monoclonal antibodies and the therapeutic proteins. So these products came to CDER around that time, and so we've been reviewing a number of biologics starting about 2005. That's the explanation.
Okay. No, that's great. Thank you for that. I see we have a question from Joy Whitsett. Joy, we'll go ahead and unmute your line, and you can ask your question, please.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. My name is Joy Whitsett, and I am a director with the Patient-Centered Solutions Group at IQVIA. And I had a question for Pooja or Nicki or any of the FDA panelists regarding how to interact with FDA for questions that might be outside of a Type C meeting. I saw in the timelines that most of the interactions with FDA throughout the engagement were using Type C meetings, but those meetings are really granted at the discretion of the division. And we have had instances where the division doesn't grant the meetings and asks the sponsor to just submit the information to the IND itself. And so I'm wondering if there are any other ways that we might be able to engage with the COA, the division of COA, or to get those questions answered during development when you're outside of a milestone meeting.
Maybe I can start answering that. Well, every time you want to have a meeting, you're certainly welcome to send a meeting request to the review division, and we consider these request by request, and many of these meetings are granted. We have literally hundreds of meetings a year where we interact with industry, and many of them are Type C meeting. They're going to be a Type C meeting if it's not, if it doesn't mean the criteria for Type B, it's probably going to be a Type C meeting. There can be situations where the division may, look at what is being requested and feel like the meeting is not needed, and recommend, if it's a very, for example, a very focused question that may not need a full meeting, that the interaction be done less formally through a submission to the IND. So I cannot speak to your specific situation, but that's my general answer. If you think you need a meeting, you may request it, and the division will tell you how to proceed. But in every situation, we'll try to answer your question one way or another.
I'll just add from a DCOA standpoint that if DCOA input is needed, you would still go through and request the meeting as you would through the therapeutic area review division, and then they will bring DCOA in as participants. And I think you could also request DCOA on your meeting request. So that might help as well to just kind of flag that.
Does that help, Joy?
Yeah, thank you. I just didn't know if there were any alternate methods outside of a type C meeting. I guess a written response only would be a solution. It looked like Nicki used that. So.
Yeah, I would say. Yeah. Oh no. With the written responses as well. I mean, sometimes it was an initial document going in and then getting written responses back, and there was at least once, or likely more, where it was back and forth. You know, we get written response back, and then we still have clarifying questions, or we would, you know, would this satisfy? And then making sure we went back to the agency to get that clarification. So I don't want to give the impression that every interaction was just we hand something and then we get something, or we send something in and we have a meeting. There is some back and forth that can happen, and I find that to be a really efficient
I can mute
way.
people. I can unmute people.
We had the same situation.
So I'm now the host of the event. Yep.
Sorry about that, folks. Go ahead, Pooja.
There was especially more back and forth. We shared a lot of data because, you know, we would send data and then COA would get back to us with comments, the agency would get back, and then we would have follow-up questions. And then there was certainly that back and forth. And I agree with Nicki, that was very helpful because it did help clarify a lot of the questions that we had. Not all meetings were in person. There were some phone meetings, some written responses only. And I think all that together helped us eventually make sure that we were reaching the right destination.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for your question, Joy. And you can lower your hand now and we'll remute your line. Lynn, you have a question. Please go ahead and ask it.
Thank you so much for taking my call. This is Lin Zhan from Beijing. I'm the HUR lead for the immuno-oncology compounds. I have two questions to the audience. The first question is, 6 years ago, when I worked on the prostate cancer compounds, the FDA told us, you know, we cannot put this on label because this instrument has not been validated for the specific population in our phase 3 clinical trial. So my first question is, the instrument's validation is still required now if we want to pursue a label claim? And the second question is for the secondary endpoint, is possible to get a label claim? And how about exploratory endpoint? I know a couple of years ago, I attended one of the meeting that the audience said is limited chance to get a label claim if it's put in exploratory endpoint. So I want to confirm the expert on the call if it's still the situation at this moment. Thank you.
Maybe I can answer the second question.
Oh, go ahead, Eric.
Maybe,
yeah, please.
I think the way I understand the second question is whether an exploratory endpoint that would be a PRO could be described enabling. Is that the question?
My second question is regarding the PRO endpoint. Is exploratory endpoint if a to get label? Yeah.
Yes. So you still need to address type 1 error, right? So there needs to be a prospective plan on how you will evaluate the endpoint, and that needs to fit in your analysis plan. So if it's one of 20 endpoints and you did not specify ahead of time that you wanted to have it enabling, that would be a problem. So if there is a PRO that you wish to have described enabling, that you need to identify that with the agency, and you need to have a plan on how you will analyze it. The first question I let Electra maybe answer.
Sure. So, so the the situation that you're describing is, using an existing instrument for maybe a new context. It could be a new population, for example. And so I think there you still want to make sure that there's a good match between the concept measured by the instrument with what is important in that population. And so if not, you have to think about, well, what are the differences? Could there be maybe a relevant portion of an existing instrument that might be identified and used? So I think the first part is to really ensure, that the concepts match in the new population as well. And is there any patient input at all? Sometimes it may be very helpful to get some input from the new target population. But, I think that is something where there's some opportunity to perhaps supplement what is already published. And then do the items really cover the concept that you're trying to establish, that you're trying to measure? Are there irrelevant items? Are there important items that maybe have been omitted for that particular patient population? Are the items targeted for the severity level in the new patient population? That's another thing you need to consider, because you want to avoid ceiling effects and floor effects. And so based on these different considerations, you can consider perhaps, whether you can use it as is, or you might want to make some modifications to the instrument before applying it to the new context. So those are just some points to consider.
Thank you so much. If
thank you.
we decided to work on the psychometric validation, so when will be the best time to conduct it? It should be at phase 2 study, right?
Generally, and that is an opportune time to do that. The instrument really should be in good shape and final form or near final form before it goes into phase 2, and then that's where you will understand more about the ability to detect change, and also you can start using methods to identify what meaningful within patient change might be. So yeah, I think and that also speaks to the importance of planning early so that you can get your instruments in the phase 2 trials.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions, Lynn. And you can go ahead and put your hand down now, and we'll move on to Heather. Heather has a question.
Hi, everyone. Heather, can you hear me, Stephen?
Yes, sure can.
Okay, great. Thanks. It's Heather Gellhorn, Senior Research Leader from Evidera. My question is for the FDA folks. I guess I'm interested in just how these 2 approvals and label claims in migraines might affect sort of your perception and review of any subsequent submissions with the same indication in the same area. For example, are you seeking to kind of be consistent in terms of the concepts that are measured and how they're reported and those types of things? Would you be open to additional new measures? So just, kind of how has this affected the landscape now in migraine?
Yeah, maybe I can make a couple of comments about this. The first one is that we're very interested in getting some kind of functional measure in migraine studies, right? Traditionally, the endpoint looked mostly for preventive drugs look mostly at the frequency of migraine attacks, but they did not really look at the disability of patients. So we were very happy to see some of these measures being used for the CGRP products. And we certainly, for new development programs of migraine drugs, we really would want to see some kind of functional measure to be used as a secondary endpoint. But as Dr. Kozawa alluded to earlier, the fact that some endpoints have been used doesn't mean there is no room for improvement there. And then considering the importance of the endpoint, continuing work to try to come up maybe with measure that may be more sensitive or more comprehensive, more precise, is certainly desirable. And this is not just specific to the situation here. It's true in general, right? There is always room for improvement, of outcome measures, and we engage constantly with sponsors in trying to find the best way to improve the measures and have an endpoint that performs better in studies.
Thank you for that question.
The only thing I would add to that is not conflating desirability with requirements for approvability. The mere fact, our interest is in reflecting, again, the impacts on the patient, as Dr. Bastings just described. We're very happy about that, but it would not be the correct interpretation to say, Dr. Kozawa mentioned earlier, there's this perception of gold standards out there when things, get into labeling, and not only are we open to alternative approaches, but we're not intending to establish some unstated new minimum bar or degree of evidence, or scope of evidence, I should say, that's required for approvability. Dr. Kozawa, I'm kind of echoing some of what you said earlier, and I know Dr. Bastings referred to that as well. I don't know if you'd like to say anything more about that.
No, I mean, I can, I agree, and it does kind of just echo back to what I said earlier, that the fact that we're supporting and involved with, the MyCOAS grant just speaks to our interest in continuing to work in this space and not view what's already in the label as the gold standard, but I also agree with your point that it's not a requirement, but it's certainly an area that we're interested in.
Thanks, Heather. You can lower your hand now, and we'll move on to Vivian. Vivian, you have a question. We'll unmute you.
Hello, everyone. I know we're almost at time, so I'll make this quick. So I'm Vivian Shi. I'm the Patient-Centered Science Director in AstraZeneca. Just want to say it's very impressive work by both the sponsor and FDA across the years to develop these PROs, and I definitely agree that's the ideal path, but I find that there's increasing challenges with accelerated programs in the industry, which prevents this pre-work to ensure that there's a fit-for-purpose PRO to be used or one that's acceptable for a label claim. So I just want to put that out there. The other question was actually for the sponsors. I'm curious to see, what do you think was the greatest pain point or challenge throughout this process, and what are your positive surprises that you didn't expect before?
I don't know. I mean, the pain points, I don't know that it's specific to this. I think the pain points are, the focus of my job is clinical outcome assessments and patient-focused drug development, but that's not the focus. That's not the everyday job of the entire cross-functional team. And in drug development, everyone has their own issues, and sometimes you're fighting for space in a briefing document because safety has questions and clinical and then stats, and it's how can you get it all in there, and having, so that it's always frustrating when we know, we need to go early, but going early doesn't mean you get your question asked. It just means, you might go to a meeting. And I think the pleasant piece, and I already alluded to, was the very straightforward interaction that we were able to have with the agency, with clear questions, clear responses, and never a clear, absolutely you're fine, it's getting in the label, or a no, it's not, but a very clear description of where the thinking was in the moment, what they thought the issues might be, what they would expect. And it was never questioning or trying to figure out, what they were really thinking. So that was, I hate to say a pleasant surprise because I don't want to imply that that never happens, but that was sort of a pleasant surprise.
I think from my perspective, our biggest pain point, and I think we mentioned this earlier, managing expectations within the company on what the outcome would be and what we expect to see on the label, especially like I mentioned with, information that another sponsor is deciding to go in another direction. So managing that expectation was difficult. I think for me, the most pleasantly surprising part was how engaged the Amgen cross-functional team was. The clinical, very often you have this back and forth where sometimes your clinical development team may not want to, introduce a PRO, which sometimes increases the time and the effort associated with the clinical trial as well as recruitment of patients and such. And there's concerns around patient burden and those kind of things, especially in a therapeutic area like migraine, where all your data is patient-reported, but everyone at Amgen was very enthusiastic about being able to accurately capture the patient voice. So that was something that really helped us push the PRO forward. And as Nicki mentioned, the support that we got from the FDA was also phenomenal. That's what made sure that we were able to get to the point that we eventually got to.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Vivian, yeah, thanks for your question. You can lower your hand now. And we do have until the bottom of the hour. There was going to be time set aside for wrap up, but there's not much to wrap up, and I'd rather spend some time on some substantive questions here. So this has been very useful. Jesper, we will open up your mic so you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you. I'm Jesper Nergaard from Novo Nordisk. I'm working as a COA specialist. I was just wondering, there's also 2 additional antibodies marketed in the US, fremanezumab and eptinezumab. And I was just looking at their labels and I don't see similar claims in their labels. Could you probably the FDA staff explain a little bit why they didn't manage to have these claims in their labels?
Yeah, this is Eric Bastings. There are a couple of things I can say about that. The first one is that these measures were not required for approval, obviously, since as you know, they don't have these endpoints in the label. The specific reason why these are not in the label are probably described in the review summary. So I don't know on top of my head why that is the case, but if you're interested in more insight about the endpoint, and it is true for any drug that has been approved, the reviews are publicly available, and you can go on the FDA website and pull the reviews, and you probably can find the explanation there about why a measure is or is not in a label.
Okay.
Thank you, Jesper. We'll take one more question from Anne.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. My name is Anne Sklicki. I'm from Evidera, research scientist. I had a general question. In de novo instrument development, I know, Pooja, you had talked about them being in a standalone validation study apart from a clinical trial. But in the case where you're developing the measure or wanting to validate with clinical trial data, what's the agency's view about remaining blinded in that validation process versus actually establishing or looking at the measurement properties by treatment group? And this is just a sort of a debate that keeps surfacing in conversations with statisticians. So I'd be interested in hearing. Thank you.
And was that a question for?
I guess for, and well, actually, probably maybe the agency would be able to respond better.
Okay. Anyone?
Do we need to get the question restated? Nobody's grabbing it. You want to maybe just kind of question? Because I'm it's something that I'm not sure that we all quite grasped.
Yeah, I think you know, typically maybe the approach would be to use blinded data in a validation, the psychometric validation process, versus being unblinded and knowing treatment groups and assessing your measurement properties and characteristics using unblinded data.
I see. Dr. Papadopoulos, do you want to take a shot at that? I mean, I find myself thinking about the linear process of, you know, qualitative and quantitative, you know, investigations, but do you have a specific stance on some of those questions?
I haven't encountered that before, honestly. So I'm not sure. I think it would be interesting to learn a little bit more about the rationale for or against that approach. But personally, I have not encountered it.
Right. Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that it's going to be a contextualized answer to your question. You know, and I think that any given data set and any given approach to generating those data probably almost certainly has strengths and weaknesses associated with it. And so, you know, I think in consideration of blinded versus unblinded data, you have to, you know, really think about the details of the context that you're working in. You know, how does the state of blinding influence the interpretability or even the fundamental nature of the data in question? So probably tough to kind of distill that down to a single answer, but it's, you know, it's discussable.
Thank you.
Laura Lee, did you have a response?
Sure, this is Laura Lee Johnson, and I am not the biostatistics division director that oversees neurology, but I am one of the ones for CDER. And I will say that internally, similar to where Billy was going, like every situation is unique, and we have discussions with groups. But what we will typically do is blinded data is used to assess the psychometric properties. And after that, and after you've done that assessment for those properties, then there would be a discussion and an understanding as you're trying to compare the arms. And inside of the agency, many times we actually have two separate teams inside the Office of Biostatistics that are doing these types of analyses. And so even if they're happening kind of in calendar time in parallel, they are not happening and talking to each other. So they're kind of firewalled from each other, and then we hear about the psychometric properties, and after that, then we start having a discussion about your typical clinical trial discussions that you would have with any endpoint. I hope that helps clarify that to a certain extent. I don't know, Billy, if you want to comment more.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dr. Johnson. I would just reiterate that I guess in terms of the distilled question, what do we want to use to assess psychometric properties? That it's really good for you to clarify that begins with blinded data. It's kind of the subsequent aspects that you know, might be more of the contextual situation. But yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Yes, thank you, Laura Lee. And we are out of time. And so this is the end of the workshop, but the end of this session, and it was a very valuable session. And I want to sincerely thank everyone who participated in this today because it was a great discussion. And so thanks everybody who attended, and we will have our second day starting at 11 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. So I wish you all the best for the rest of the day and hope to see you all back here tomorrow. And again, thanks panel very much. It was great. Bye-bye now. We will adjourn. Yeah.